Okay, welcome Twitch chat and YouTube. Special stream today. Today is February 15th, 2021, and Wizards of the Coast has announced they will be blowing up every format in existence and banning a lot of the 2019-2020 mistake cards in them. The most relevant for me, of course, is Vintage, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Vintage has the one-liner Lurrus of the Dream Den is unbanned. Everyone's favorite cat nightmare. Let's see what they said. Because this actually was really well written, and I highly recommend reading it if you are playing in the other formats as well. Shortly after Ikoria, Lurrus was added to the Vintage ban list solely due to power level for the unique reason that it could not be restricted because of companion. Makes sense, basically. It's like cards on the same vein as Bolus's Citadel, Mystic Sanctuary cards that restriction doesn't really do anything to. Obviously, it was even to a higher extreme because of the companion mechanic that has it be played from outside the game, technically from your sideboard. So at the time, Vintage was pretty dominated by Lurrus, and if people wanted to play decks that weren't Lurrus, it kind of had to go. Um, and it probably it says the power level benefit of Lurrus's companion was way too high in comparison to its deck building cost. There is a deck building cost to Lurrus. Not being able to play 3 mana planeswalkers, not being able to play Tinker Bolas the Citadel, Monastery Mentor, these kind of cards. The cost is real, but at 0 mana to put into your or to play from the original companion ruling was not was not a high enough cost, and as such, Lurrus was basically the entire format. So for those who don't remember what happened, Lurrus and all of the companion was changed to have an additional 3 mana costs that you have to pay 3 mana at sorcery speed to put the card into your hand. This basically destroyed companion in a lot of the older formats, though I guess it's a little hard to say because Legacy still has Lurrus and Zerta banned. But as far as Vintage goes, you were seeing some Lutri, you were seeing some Zerta, but mostly Lurrus. And after the cost was changed, you don't really see almost any Lutri or Zerta. And obviously Lurrus has still been banned until today. And so basically I would say at the encouragement of the community kind of has been reaching out over time to Wizards and saying, hey, you changed this cost. We think that at 3 extra mana, this card is no longer to be a huge problem, so we'd like to see it unbanned. And so they talk about a key aspect of Vintage is that you can play every card that's been printed. Even Ancestral Recall and Black Lotus, these cards are restricted, but they're still legal. And so what they said they're going to do is they're running an experiment. They're unbanning Lurrus, and they are totally willing to reban Lurrus if it is problematic. But they say it should be given a chance, which is what myself and a lot of the other community members have been saying. Which I think is totally the right approach. One of the big problems of Lurrus in the previous rule set is that if you had a Black Lotus in your hand, you always had turn 1 Lurrus, and it costs no mana as you regrew your Black Lotus. And these made for very snowballing, very one-sided games when Black Lotus was drawn. So, I think that this is a really well-written, small 2 paragraphs that hit all the points you need to about what happened, why it happened, and talk about. I really like this, a key aspect of the spirit of Vintage. Thought that was kind of cool, and I like that they're running this as an experiment. And so one thing I do ask is that if this experiment turns out Lurrus is broken still, right? Turns out Lurrus is too good for Vintage still, and it gets rebanned. I don't want to see like negative feedback to WotC for the unbanning of Lurrus, because I think the idea of experimenting with unbans is going to be really good for Vintage going forward. I think there's a decent amount of cards that are currently on the Vintage restricted list that could be unrestricted. And they just aren't unrestricted out of fear, right? They don't want doesn't want to look bad. They don't want it to, when people really hammered on WotC when they unbanned Golgari Grave Troll in Modern, and then they had to reban it. I really want the feedback of running an unbanning experiment in Vintage to be positive, so that hopefully in the future we see more experiments like this. That's just something I wanted to touch on really quickly. So let's talk about Lurrus, right? Let's talk about where does Lurrus fit in into the metagame. And so the first thing I did when I saw that Lurrus was unbanned is I used MTG Goldfish's advanced search feature, which is fantastic for anyone who hasn't used that. And I searched for the last couple months of lists that had Lurrus in them, and I pulled up a couple of the ones that I thought were notable, and that had merit, and that were doing well when Lurrus was unnerfed. And I think the first one that you have to touch on, and the one that makes the most sense, and the one that is the most important, is Underworld Breach. Now, this is the only, from my point of view, the only deck that takes very little cons in including Lurrus, uh, and gets a large upside, right? So if you looked at like an Underworld Breach deck that's getting played currently, and we'll put aside the Tinker Citadel versions. Let's just say a true Underworld Breach combo deck. The only cards in the deck that that do not fit Lurrus's requirement of being permanents with 2 mana or less are one of Planeswalkers, so one of Dak, one of Narset, and Monastery Mentor as an alternative win condition. And now these are not no cost, but they are the minimum low bar of cuts that I would think that a deck could make, and considered probably not a huge cut. So I think that the first deck you need to think about is you need to think about Breach, and you need to think about how does this affect Breach, and how does it upgrade Breach, basically. Now, this is not my recommended Breach list for Lurrus. This is not the best thing. What I did is I just simply took a recently winning Lurrus Breach list from back when Lurrus was printed. I believe this is a Shere Khan list, just so you could see what something might look like. Like things like Intuition have kind of we've moved on from those in the iterations of Breach, though putting cards in your yard does get better when you have Lurrus, so maybe it's something to think about. The main things you notice when you see a Lurrus deck, and I don't know if these are going to stay true with the nerfed Lurrus, is you'll see things like Nihil Spellbomb and Soul Guide Lantern in the main. You'll see things like Seal of Fire and Deadweight in the main, and these these recurring removal spells in the form of enchantments, Seal of Fire and Deadweight and Seal of Primordium, Seal of Cleansing. Those were really big because not only did they kill opposing Lurruses, but you would just be able to rebuy them every turn. They were win conditions. This one, of course, is a win condition in and of itself. The question will end up becoming how much Lurrus do you see? Is including these kind of effects in your deck worthwhile still with the cost of Lurrus? And I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm just going to provide you with the questions that you can then answer yourself. I really like the idea of having a Soul Guide Lantern or a Nihil Spellbomb in the main deck of your Lurrus deck. I think it provides you with extra graveyard hate. Again, and Dredge is an extremely powerful deck, so any extra edges you can get against Dredge are really, really important. Another thing you're going to see a lot is the return of Dark Confidant. Now, Dark Confidant is a returnable permanent off of Lurrus that is card advantage. It doesn't actually get hit by Narset, which is always pretty cool. The one thing that I'm worried about for Dark Confidant is the fact that Wrenn and 6 is on a very large uptick, big upswing of Rug and 4-color Deathray Shaman decks, and this card is really not the strongest when your opponent is playing a Wrenn and 6. Obviously, if they're lightning bolting this and you're bringing it back with Lurrus, you're getting a huge advantage. But if opponent is Wrenn and 6ing this down, it is not as strong. Another one you guys see in the sideboard here is Sprite Dragon. I think Sprite Dragon is a card that benefits from Lurrus being unbanned, a returnable threat that the big problem with I have typically with Sprite Dragon is that it gets pyroblasted, and normally you don't want your threats to be pyroblasted. This is a deck that had a metagame where 4 pyroblast was in the main deck, and your Sprite Dragon dying to pyroblast is problematic. However, the nice part about dying to pyroblast is it's not Swords to Plowshares, and it goes into your graveyard, and it can be rebought with Lurrus, who is not pyroblastable. So Sprite Dragon actually becomes a more reliable alternative kill plan for a Lurrus deck. The one thing you need to be aware of is that Monastery Mentor and Tinker Citadel are 2 ways that Underworld Breach decks are avoiding graveyard hate, right? So if someone brings in Leylines of the Void against you, you don't have to breach kill them because you have Tinker Citadel, because you have Monastery Mentor. It's a way out, right? And playing Lurrus does not help you avoid graveyard hate. um, in fact, it is playing into the graveyard even heavier. So it is something to keep in mind. It's going to be very interesting to see where these decks shake out. Let's go talk about a couple other of the viable Lurrus lists from the previous metagame. I think the first one that we should talk about is PO. This is a deck that saw a lot of play, though I am skeptical on exactly how good this is in comparison to a typical PO list. PO on its own is a downside. Is already kind of on a downswing anyways. The thing that you lose when you play Lurrus in PO is you lose Tinker Citadel, which many people will tell you is the strongest part of the PO deck. PO is a great Tinker Citadel deck, and it is one of the things you do to win the game in actually probably the majority of games. So what you end up seeing, or what you did see in the past, was that PO decks relied heavily on Mystic Remora. This is a really a really annoying card when Lurrus exists. It's hard for any deck to play through a Mystic Remora. PO can basically keep it in play forever, and then even if it can't, it can rebuy the Remora with Lurrus. So you have to cut Tinker Citadel and Monastery Mentor from this deck. So it means you have to put in other alternative win conditions. So you do have to probably play a Tendrils of Agony as your Storm kill. I also like Time Vault Key, as it is returnable with Lurrus. So your PO decks look slightly different, but they function very similar. The main question is like, am I playing 2 Mystic Remora, or is this going to be a format where I need 4? That's probably, a question for a month later from now, when the format ends up settling down. But this is a deck that definitely can play Lurrus. Whether or not this deck is better than a Tinker Citadel Monastery Mentor PO build with the nerfed Lurrus, yet to be seen. Of course, you can play Lurrus PO in a different way, and you could also go for the Underworld Breach PO hybrid deck. I assume this is going to be something that Bryant tries right away, right? This fills the gap of what PO decks are currently doing with their Grixis shells or their Jeskai shells with Underworld Breach Brain Freeze. I worry about utilizing the graveyard a little bit too much with Underworld Breach and Lurrus, but the nice thing is that PO doesn't use the graveyard, so there are some upsides there. I do think that Sprite, as I said before, the Sprite Dragon Plan B gets a lot better. So maybe this is the preferred Lurrus PO deck. We'll have to see. Like I said, not 100% sure. Let's see the other decks that saw play. This is a big one. This is the 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 very classic Buffoon Esper Lurrus deck. This is like the one that Killer SUV and Bill's Live played. A really strong success during the last Lurrus metagame. This is like the true build around Lurrus deck. This is 4 Dark Confidants. You're playing Deadweights as your removal. You've got the main deck Graveyard Hate with Spell Bombs. You've got Baubles to bring back, Karakas to protect your Lurrus. You're playing kind of like an Esper tempo-y deck with tons of counter magic and recurable 2-mana permanents as your way to attack and close the game. I don't know how good a deck like this is going to be. This deck obviously was built around the original Lurrus and had, relies heavily on the fact that Lurrus is your companion as a way to gain card advantage. So we'll have to see how much the nerf affects Lurrus itself, and whether or not this deck is going to remain viable in the new metagame. This deck was very interesting because it really did kind of attack everything at the same time, right? Like you're playing no rods in your Mishra's Baubles deck, but that's not unfeasible. You can totally remove the baubles and bring the no rods in, and if everyone else is going to be doing these bobbling spellbombing things, then no rod is going to be pretty viable. The question that Oz asked, is deadweight going to be good enough, is a fair question. So deadweight is it kind of got buffed in the old metagame because everyone was on Lurrus. So there was always a target. And if Lurrus doesn't end up being as popular, I mean, I think for a little while it will always be as popular because people want to try it. But if Lurrus doesn't end up being as strong, then cards like Deadweight are not as good, depending on, what creature decks are in the metagame. One of the big creature decks right now is playing Archon of Emeria, which does not die to Deadweight. So maybe you have to play Myers Grasp instead. There's a lot of additional levels on the metagaming to end up in a a certain point at the end, right? And I think you have to start somewhere, and this is the last, I think, killer SUV list that was posted. One of the other lists that I think was a little underlooked at the time were Mosh's Noble Fish decks. And so you'll actually notice that this deck is fairly similar to the current Bant Archon decks. It is a very classic Tarmogoyf, Lavinia, Collector Roof, Noble Fish style deck. And this deck does take a huge hit losing Archon of Emeria. Archon of Emeria is like the main reason that the Bant Noblefish deck works. It's a really powerful card that attacks the metagame in a very specific way that's very, very much at odds with what the format is trying to do. So will this deck with a nerfed Lurrus be willing to lose out on Archon? I don't know. Like I said, I don't have the answers for you, chat. But I wanted to pose the questions and let someone else figure them out. But I wanted you to be aware that this kind of style of deck existed. If Collector Roof is a strong choice and Thalia and Lavinia are strong choices, then this Lurrus deck is pretty strong. Yeah, I haven't gotten to that. I haven't gotten to that point yet, Pug. I'm just going over Lurrus as a companion to start, because I actually haven't thought about Lurrus in the main deck too much. And then there's one more deck that was seeing a little play at the end, and this is ABR style Lurrus Bug. This deck loses out on Leovold and Oko, but you can very easily slot in Dark Confidants. Deathrite Shaman is weird because it's decent against graveyard strategies, but it doesn't hit artifacts, which is one of the big, or it doesn't hit artifacts or enchantments, which are the two big things that Lurrus is bringing back. It does hit creatures that Lurrus is bringing back, so it gets a little awkward. But you can see how inbred the metagame was at the time. You were seeing deadweights and unearths, and Lurrus metagame was a very interesting time to be playing Vintage for sure. Scavenging Ooze seems like a perfectly normal thing to slot into this deck that would be very good against Lurrus as well. But I think that of the decks that can choose to forego 3-drops, I actually think Bug doesn't lose that much. Like Leovold is very strong, and Oko can be situationally strong. But I do think that the core of your shell is and has always been Deathrite Shaman, Collector Roof, and Wasteland. So I actually think that this deck fits the bill pretty well when it comes to 2-drop creature decks that can use Lurrus. So this is something to consider if you are a fair bug wizard. This is not the kind of deck that I like to play, but it is a similar approach to the Esper deck, except you choosing green over white. And the white here, the nice part about the white in this deck is it makes your Lurrus very castable. Whereas in the bug deck, you can only cast your Lurrus off black. So you like your Tropical Island is not helping you cast Lurrus, but you have the addition of Deathrite Shaman, so it's probably not very bad. Okay. All right. So then there's a couple more that I want to talk about. Just some pet decks. This is something that I call Bobcat, and this is probably the first thing that we're going to try. And this is a deck that I played a bunch during the Lurrus meta game, and it's more of I think more of a pet deck than anything, but it's a deck that does work. And it's a I don't know how you describe this deck, chat. It's a tempo storm deck. Oh, what do you call this? What do we call this? The value tendrils deck. This one utilizes Dark Ritual as additional ways to pay for Lurrus. And once you start using Dark Ritual, you have to think about things like Yogwill and Tendrils kills. I found that I wanted to be able to sacrifice my Bobs, and utilizing my Bobs and my 2-mana permanents that I can bring back with Lurrus, I can then do things like sacrifice to therapy, take away their whole hand. Urza's Bauble combines very well with Lurrus, and it lets you look at cards in their hand, making your therapies hit more. This was my favorite deck of the Lurrus metagame. It was weird. It was weird. Yeah, P9 and I worked on it. Did you name it? I don't remember. It was a long time ago, wasn't it, Justin? A long time ago. Yeah, this was a cool deck. We're gonna definitely be playing some games with this deck, and like I said, I don't exactly know how to describe it. I don't know if this is the right thing to talk about, but I just love this deck. I think this deck is super interesting and a super weird section of cards that you wouldn't think would work super well together. But having the backdoor tendrils plan in your Bob deck that is dazing your opponent and restricting them on mana and taking away their hand is really cool. So this is one of my favorite decks. It's probably the deck we'll probably play first, but I just wanted to bring this up briefly. And then this isn't the one I would recommend, but I started to take the Snowstill list we've been working on and change it for Lurrus. All you really have to do is cut Narfi and cut Narset, and then you can make a Lurrus deck out of it. I just want people to recognize that Lurrus was very good in standstill decks. There weren't many people playing the standstill decks because it's standstill, but returning a broken standstill with Lurrus is pretty big game. So these controlling standstill decks counterbalance top. There's a bunch of different kind of ways you can play controlling Lurrus decks that choose just to forego the planeswalkers that you would typically find at the top end of the list. And like I said, I don't recommend this list. I just want people to be aware that you can choose to brew along a control access or a standstill access, and it can be effective. And then the final thing that I don't have a list for that is something worth talking about is Lurrus in the main deck. Lurrus was never truly explored in Vintage in the main deck, and the reason was because there was very little cost to being a companion. So it just wasn't something that people tried. Now that Lurrus costs so much to be a companion, this 3-mana cost we're assuming is a cost, is a real cost. People are going to attempt to play Lurrus decks with Lurruses in the main. And the big upside of Lurrus in the main is that when you draw your Black Lotus and your Lurrus together, you can do things like you used to find in these Esper Lurrus lists without, you can actually do them because it doesn't cost you 3 colorless to get your Lurrus. The other thing that those kind of decks allow is when you have this in your main, you don't have the companion restriction, and you can play Tinker Citadel, and you can play Monastery Mentor, and you can play all these like planeswalkers. So all of these things you can't that Lurrus would prevent you from doing typically if you play it in your main. You can get around that. Obviously, the cost is you have a cat with questionable power level in your main deck, and that's where people have to figure out if that's actually worth it. I'm probably not going to be experimenting there right away. I would rather play a bunch of matches with Lurrus as a companion to find out how bad the 3-mana cost is. If the 3-mana cost ends up not being bad, then I don't really know how much play it's going to see as a main deck card. Um, but when you do think about 3 mana costs to bring Lurrus from Companion, I guess the first thing you would really think about is these PO decks and maybe this PO Breach deck. As you have all these mana crypts and your artifacts that help you mitigate that 3 mana cost, maybe this kind of deck is where Lurrus and PO and Breach trend to. Because that would make a lot of sense. The biggest problem with this deck is that it is kind of silly when you play all of these kind of activated ability Moxen and then you get a Collector Roof slammed across the table, um Null Rod slammed across the table. So that's something to think about. But if I had to guess, this is probably where I would start on a more competitive Lurrus deck. But I think for now we're gonna work towards some Bobcat. Like I said, I want to stream until I don't feel like streaming anymore, and we're gonna try to play as much Lurrus as we can.